Today we're going to be talking about voting restrictions.
Typically, the narrative's voting restrictions prevent voter fraud but keep and discourage people from voting.
We're going to have points of views from states with different levels of voting restrictions and how these restrictions impact residents of these states.
By different levels, I mean states with expanded voter access, restricted voter access, and states that have open/mixed voter access.
We are going to focus on restricted and expanded states. First, let's discuss how the democratic principles of free and fair elections and civic participation are affected by voting restrictions.
Before that, though, what is a democratic principle?
Democratic principles are basically guides in a democratic society that protect the freedom of citizens.
Now that we have that out of the way, let's start with free and fair election.
Citizens should be able to vote freely and fairly, hence the name.
Sometimes, though, voting restrictions prevent people from voting while keeping elections fair.
Most citizens will have to accept that without some voting restrictions, the things like voting illegally and voting more than once will arise.
But the argument is that some unnecessary voting restrictions keep people from even becoming a registered voter because of all the voting restrictions and suppressions.
And sadly, some voting restrictions are targeted at minorities.
For example, a survey gathered information on the states with the highest turnout of Black Americans. 7 out of 11 of the states with the highest population of Black Americans had implemented laws that restricted or suppressed their process of voting.
Another example is that the 12 states with the highest population of Hispanics, 9 of them had new voting restriction laws targeted at certain groups.
A part of being a citizen in a democratic society is participating civically. One of the ways that a citizen participates civically is by voting.
But when someone either can't register to vote or is deterred by voting restrictions that make voting too difficult, then they can't participate as much in a government that is supposed to be run by the people.
One example of minorities having a hard time voting is this account from a Black American trying to vote and being met with a line hours long because access to ballot boxes was limited in their community of color.
Although voting restrictions aren't limited to those of color and minorities, these communities seem to have a harder time voting.
Let's imagine you are voting in different states.
First off, let's head to the beautiful beaches of Hawaii to experience voting in a state with expanded voter access.
In Hawaii, to become a valid voter, you will need a state ID or driver's license, so no voter ID.
Then, if you are a valid voter, then you will automatically be sent a ballot 18 days prior to the election.
Voter IDs are one of the main talking points when it comes to voting and how they are unnecessarily and that it isn't fair that some states don't and do have them.
Some identification is definitely needed to prove who you say you are. Now we're going to head to the opposite side of the U.S. to rainy Florida, a state with restricted voter access.
Oh, when you need another card that seems to do the same as the other identification cards, like a driver's license or state ID, then it seems pointless.
The fraud that these voter IDs are trying to get rid of is extremely rare, with there being about 2 fraudulent convictions in 200 million votes. Now we're going to head to the opposite side of the U.S. to a rainy Florida, a state with restricted voter access. To register to vote, you will need a state ID or driver's license.
To vote by mail, you'll need a state ID number or at least 4 numbers of your social security number.
There is no alternative for voting by mail, so if you have neither identification numbers, and you can't vote in person, then you just can't vote.
Now that we have seen how voting restrictions affect citizens' democratic principles, what voting is like in different states, and finally, what people are most affected by voting restrictions.
What are your thoughts on voting restrictions?
Our take on it is that some voting restrictions are required to help preserve election integrity and keep voting free from fraud. Other voting restrictions have got to go, seeing that all they do is keep people from voting.
And that isn't free or fair. The sources I used are in the description.